Frightening images from across the internet are giving us the horrors of modern warfare in real time. Although Israel's technologically superior military has been wreaking havoc throughout Iran, Iran's response has generated some surprising results, at least according to some observers. Prior to the outbreak of war, Iran had the largest arsenal of ballistic missiles in the Middle East, clearly with the objective of overwhelming Israel's vaunted Iron Dome defense system, and at least to some extent, they have been successful, surprisingly successful to some observers. So far, 24 people have been killed in Israel by these missile strikes and more than 500 wounded, with dozens of buildings being so seriously damaged that they will have to be torn down in the aftermath of the strike. It has created an atmosphere of fear in Israel that hasn't existed since the time of the Yom Kippur War in the early 1970s. All of that having been said, though, virtually nobody has been talking about the implications that these strikes represent for the construction of the so-called Golden Dome defense system that Donald Trump would like to build with the assistance of Elon Musk and SpaceX. And most spaceflight journalists are extremely interested in Golden Dome and what it might mean for the future of the space industry and the enormous Space Force investment that would be required in order to build such a missile defense network over the entire continental United States. But almost nobody is talking about the fact that there are some very straightforward and less expensive ways to defeat a system like this, and just building it might make nuclear war far more likely than anyone realizes. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Bulletin. And as I'm sure you can probably tell by now, we're going to be talking about the Golden Dome. I just love that name to start off with. I mean, think about it. If you want to make something that's better than the Iron Dome in Trump's mind, well, you don't make, say, the Steel Dome or the Titanium Dome or maybe something interesting like the Cobalt Dome. No. The only thing that could be better than an Iron Dome would be something more valuable, a Golden Dome. Before I get Trump supporters anymore angry at me, I just need to make sure that everybody understands that I have a pretty equal view when we're talking about U.S. presidents. Over the last 30, 40 years, really haven't been a big fan of any of them. We need to go back quite some ways for me to, at least in retrospect, find somebody that I had a lot of respect for, and that was President Ronald Reagan. Wasn't necessarily a big fan of a lot of his policies, but I'm not going to get into details about any of that. But one thing that I really liked about the guy, first of all, he was just very charismatic, but he also took responsibility for things that were his fault, or at least things that he thought should fall under his purview. Sure, maybe he wasn't the one who was actually responsible for any given decision, but when it comes to the president, the buck stops here, and I always liked that philosophy that he had. But something else that defined Ronald Reagan's presidency was how he handled the Cold War, how he handled the confrontation with the Soviet Union. And at the time, I actually didn't really have an understanding of what his strategy was. It was only in the aftermath that we came to understand exactly what he was trying to do, and SDI was one of the keystones of his strategy, even though it was never really implemented. And when it came to things like that, at first I thought it sounded like a really great idea. Let's make a defense network capable of knocking down ICBMs, and so it will make nuclear weapons obsolete. But then later on, Carl Sagan wrote an article about the topic and explained how SDI could be defeated, even by a country that was technologically inferior, such as the Soviet Union. And over time, as I became more and more educated on the topic, I became more and more opposed to the entire concept. I even showed up to an anti-SDI demonstration. But more significantly, at least as far as things that I did that I thought had impact, at least for me personally, is I took a class on SDI policy at the University of Colorado, but it wasn't some left-wing professor who was teaching it. It was actually an Air Force Academy instructor who was on loan to CU to run this class. And it was actually a graduate level class that was available to undergraduates as well. And he had served on President Reagan's cabinet as well. Reagan was still president at the time, but he had spent a couple of years as a military advisor on the cabinet, especially in regards to SDI. That was his specialty. I can't imagine anybody more qualified to teach a class about SDI than him. I wrote my final paper for that class and argued why SDI actually made a nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union far more likely than less likely. I really put as much effort as I could, as much research as I could into it to present as compelling an argument as I could. By the way, my instructor was very pro SDI, and he gave me an A+ on the paper. And so now we have the Golden Dome, which really is the same thing, just baked into a new package, new technology, more advanced technology, obviously 4 decades later. But is it any more viable today than it was then? Granted, sure, SDI created a lot of anti-missile technology, such as the Patriot missile system and other missile systems related to it, that have proven quite beneficial. But is it a system that's actually going to be viable for protecting a nation as large as the United States? And even if it is it going to make nuclear war less likely? Well, although very few people are talking this way these days, and I find that to be a bit disturbing, to be honest, I'm going to show you why a Golden Dome defense system is far more likely to create an extremely charged and hostile environment when it comes to potential nuclear conflict, not just between the U.S. and Russia, but with an emerging nuclear power, currently less powerful than us, but that could change very quickly, and that is the People's Republic of China. Okay, first of all, let's compare the SDI that I talked about back in the 80s. And yes, I did type out this paper on a conventional typewriter, but let's compare that with what's going on right now between Israel and Iran. The Iron Dome system is immensely effective and a multi-layered system that has defended Israel quite well from conventional attacks over the last several decades. However, Israel has a much easier task to perform with Iron Dome than a potential nuclear defense system would have in defending the United States. First of all, just the flat-out geography. Israel's total land area is approximately 8,550 square miles. It is a very small country, whereas the United States has a land area of 3,796,742 square miles. This means the United States is 444 times larger than Israel in terms of land area. That is a huge amount of airspace to defend. And also, Iron Dome only has to defend Israel from conventional weapons. In other words, it can use multiple layers of defense to stop ICBMs as they're coming in without having to worry too much about the consequences. Their first layer of defense intercepts these missiles while they're still in space. The next levels then stop the missiles as they get lower and lower in altitude, and sometimes Israel can afford to allow some of these missiles to simply proceed on their merry way because they're going to hit an uninhabited area like an empty parking lot. Nuclear attacks would not have the same kind of luxury. All you have to do is get within a couple kilometers of your target and you're going to utterly annihilate it with a nuclear weapon. And not only that, nuclear bombs detonate at a very high altitude. Now, tactical nuclear weapons only detonate at a height of about 220 meters for 1 kiloton, but the optimal burst height for a larger bomb, like 100 kilotons, is 1 kilometer, and for a 10 megaton nuclear blast, 4.7 kilometers. In other words, about halfway to the altitude of a commercial jet. At this point, I'm going to start quoting an article entitled Transmuting Iron to Gold on this topic. And let's go ahead and start with the comparisons between Iron Dome and Golden Dome right off the bat. Our dear leader, as well as various esteemed members of Congress and the mainstream press, are clearly impressed by the advertised successes of the Iron Dome system and infer that it implies that a successful anti-ICBM system is feasible. Now, a professional baseball shortstop is highly effective at catching a line drive hit his way. The baseball is representative of the kinds of missiles launched by Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Houthis against Israel, pretty effectively countered by Iron Dome. Now suppose we replace the batter with a rifleman, firing a bullet flying more than 7 times as fast as the baseball. How well do you think the shortstop will do in snagging it? That's the analogy. Baseballs versus bullets. And even though Iran's technology is far inferior to what they're facing in Israel, their conventional intermediate-range ballistic missiles have still been able to penetrate Iron Dome. Iron Dome has had a high percentage of success, but not perfect. If you're talking about a nuclear strike, anything less than perfection is failure. So Iran has demonstrated, even with their relatively primitive technology and limited supply of missiles, how to defeat a missile defense system that even has multiple layers of defense defending a tiny country, and that is to simply swamp that defense system with lots of missiles. And SDI had the same problem, and that's what Carl Sagan talked about over 40 years ago. It was a bad idea then, and it's a bad idea today. More so now because of the deteriorated geopolitical situation and the status of treaties intended to limit nuclear weapons inventories and proliferation. From a purely technical point of view, very little has changed. There have been no sufficiently grand technological breakthroughs to make any of the approaches more feasible or even affordable. A recent report from the American Physical Society on Strategic Ballistic Missile Defense outlines the problem of countering an attack from North Korea, for example, in terms of numbers of assets required and their costs. Basically, it says that even if we can develop a 100% effective system, which is to say, one which destroys each and every ICBM that North Korea launches against us, and that system is 100% effective in distinguishing the actual ICBM warheads from the numerous decoys that will be deployed and defeating all other countermeasures, a system would require 6,600 space-based interceptors to intercept a raid consisting of 12 North Korean ICBMs, including at least some of their latest models, launched in burst salvos of 4 during the boost phase of ICBM flight. Assuming a 1-ton interceptor unit costs about $20 million, and the use of the Falcon Heavy launch vehicle to deploy them, the launch of these is estimated to be $142 billion, not including sensors, command and control, and maintenance. Notice that for an ICBM cost of $10 million, the defense to offense cost ratio is over 1,000 to 1. Notice also that a linear extrapolation of this cost to counter a Russian attack involving 1,200 missiles of their 870 land-based and 640 sub-based missiles, that's under current START limits, would be $14.2 trillion, about half the current U.S. GDP. As we spend about 3.5% of GDP annually on defense, this number represents about 14 years of total DoD spending. That's assuming we spend all of our defense spending for 14 years on this system. So the DoD budget would need to double during the period of a 14-year SDI production and deployment. The first question that comes to mind is, how could we possibly afford it? And then the next question we might ask concerns the reasonableness of the effectiveness of countermeasures assumptions. As we are dealing with nuclear weapons here, there is a distinction in comparison to conventional weapons in terms of the effectiveness required. For a North Korean scenario in which the adversary might launch, say, 12 missiles, our defense has to have an effectiveness of 99.916% if we can accept a probability that 1% of a missile succeeds in getting through and decimating a city. In air defense circles, an effectiveness in the range of 80 to 90% is considered outstanding. We ask ourselves, how many shots would we have to take against those 12 missiles with the system having an 85% effectiveness to achieve that 1% probability of a single U.S. city being vaporized? The answer is 4 independent shots per missile, or 48 missiles engaging actual warheads for the entire North Korean attack. The requirement for shots per target grows with the number of threats being countered. For a 150 missile raid, representing a limited Russian or Chinese attack, the number of shots per target needs to be 5, leading to a requirement of 750 shots. For the quoted Russian attack, we would need 6 shots per valid warhead, leading to an inventory of 7,200 interceptors. It is emphasized that these calculations assume a perfect ability to distinguish between a true target and a decoy during the engagement, an entirely unjustifiable assumption. Prudence would demand an increase in the number of shots per target to account for enemy decoys and countermeasures. In any event, it is clear that any system that is remotely affordable will have to be imperfect, with a significant number of enemy weapons reaching their targets. The most damning aspect of the Golden Dome program is not its cost or risk of infeasibility, though, but rather its effect on efforts to limit nuclear weapons inventories. Since there is a huge cost advantage of offensive nuclear weapons over ballistic missile defense, both the Chinese and the Russians will simply respond to Golden Dome by deploying more weapons. In fact, there are indications that they already are, in response to the existing $10 billion a year U.S. ballistic missile defense effort. Both adversaries know full well that our present capability is minimal, with the pitiful level of success-oriented testing to date achieving only about 50% effectiveness, but they must hedge their bets against the possibility of a breakthrough. In the U.S., proponents for Golden Dome include the nuclear weapons and defense industries, the space industry, in other words, Elon Musk, and various political entities such as the Heritage Foundation. Also included in the mix are politicians, motivated by factors including a fear of Trump, a fear of being tarred as weak on defense, or who, like the Russians and Chinese, want to hedge their bets. And by the way, the argument made in this article is essentially no different than the argument that Carl Sagan made 4 decades ago. The best way to defeat a missile defense system, especially a missile defense system that has to defend such a huge area of territory like the continental United States, is just to swamp it. Swamp it with lots more nuclear weapons, together with a variety of decoys and countermeasures. And of course, the best way to build that kind of arsenal is to accelerate your nuclear weapons program. Instead of all of the reductions that we've been doing over the last 30 years, to completely reverse all of that and build an arsenal that's comparable to the stockpiles that we had during the time of the Cold War. And even though Russia may not have the resources and the funds to build an arsenal that huge, China most definitely does have that capability. And right now, they're doing their best to build a large enough arsenal to be a credible threat against the United States, but a credible Golden Dome project would incent the Chinese to start a new nuclear arms race that would unquestionably rival the arms race that we had to deal with during the time of the Cold War. Now, of course, this was Ronald Reagan's strategy back at this time, and one of the reasons why Gorbachev was so desperate to get Reagan to give up on the idea of SDI because he knew that Russia would have to build a far bigger arsenal to counter it, just as Iran has built thousands of ballistic missiles to counter the Iron Dome system. And that was an expense that the Soviet Union could not afford any longer. And of course, Reagan knew this and wanted to force the Soviet Union to continue to spend an unsustainable amount on defense until they crashed their own economy, which of course they did. However, China's economy is not nearly as vulnerable as the Soviet Union's was. And if we start a new Cold War arms race, the likes of which this world has not seen since the 1980s, we may not be so lucky this time. On at least 3 different occasions, the United States and Soviet Union nearly went to war, mostly over misunderstandings and malfunctions, but had the people in charge actually follow procedure, they would have pushed the button and I wouldn't be recording this video right now. Are we going to be that lucky a second time? And for those who argue that a system like this might be effective in a more limited form designed to stop nations like North Korea or perhaps Iran if they develop a bomb from eventually delivering it, I say this. In a day when nuclear weapons can be delivered inside a suitcase, the sad reality is that if a rogue nation manages to get a hold of a nuclear weapon that they are dead set determined to use, they will find a way to deliver it. And the only effective method of preventing that nightmare scenario from happening is to prevent these nations from developing these weapons in the first place, as Israel is doing at this very moment. So I'm sure many people disagree with me on all of this and say that this Golden Dome idea is the only way that we can possibly get ourselves out of this potential threat of nuclear annihilation, post-nuclear war holocaust, the threat of which we have been living with now for 3 generations. Hasn't technology evolved enough to where we can realistically build something that's capable of doing this, of freeing future generations from the possibility of a civilization-ending nuclear war? Well, sadly, no. We live in a world that has nuclear weapons in it. Not only that, we live in a world where the methods of delivering nuclear weapons, as we have seen here, are far less expensive than the methods of defeating them. And so the only thing you need to do to defeat any sort of anti-ballistic missile system is just to spend as much money, or perhaps even a little less money, than it costs to build the system in the first place, to build enough methods to defeat it. And I don't see how technology will ever be able to change that situation. Nuclear weapons exist in our world. They are always going to be a threat to our civilization. The only thing we can possibly do to reduce this threat is to reduce the number of weapons. We took huge strides after the fall of the Soviet Union to accomplish this goal, but we didn't go far enough. There are still thousands of warheads on the planet, more than enough warheads to destroy human civilization entirely and to start a nuclear winter that would threaten our utter extinction. The only way to eliminate the threat of this nightmare scenario occurring at some point, and it has nearly happened over and over again in history. There have been so many situations where mistakes, where false intelligence and all kinds of other circumstances created a situation that actually should have started World War III, but because cooler heads prevailed, World War III didn't actually happen. But several times, it very well might have, and I would not be sitting here right now making this video. My kids would not exist. And that would be the case not just for millions, but billions of fathers across the planet. The only way to free future generations, to free our children from this environment of fear, is to reduce the number of warheads drastically. Probably not going to be conceivable of getting rid of all of them, but perhaps setting a ceiling of maybe 30 or 40 warheads, something along those lines on every country. Enough warheads to take out a rogue state who decides to break the rules and develop these warheads on their own and ignore everybody's treaties, but not enough to annihilate human civilization. It wouldn't be a perfect scenario, but I see it as being at least feasible. And given the hostile environment that we live in now, the fact that current nuclear weapons reduction treaties are not being respected by some emerging nuclear powers, most significant of which is the People's Republic of China. But frankly, Russia and the United States doesn't seem terribly interested in observing any of these things as much as they did either. It seems like we are on the brink of another massive nuclear arms race. And perhaps this time, we won't be so lucky. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, thank you so much for contributing to my GoFundMe to try to get me to Australia in September. We were stuck at about 36%, but now we've jumped to 43% because of your generous support. If you would like to support this journey as well, all the details are in the description. Thanks again, and as always, stay angry about space.